Okay, AP Psych friends, we are in Unit 9 on development. Part 1, Video 1 is on prenatal development in the newborn. So a lot of this may be review for you from like a health class or a child development class. But the first thing to do is an introduction on what the major issues are concerning developmental psychology as a field. The first question that is usually brought up, the major issue, is this question of nature versus nurture. I hope you've realized now that we are, 10 units in, that it's never one or the other, right? It's trying to determine in specific instances how important genetic inheritance is, and then how compared to like experience or environment. But it's always going to be a combination of both concerning psychology. Continuity or stages, that is the question of whether or not changes in our development are a gradual thing, or if it is a very abrupt, easily identified set of stages. And so when we get to all of these different theories, like on cognitive development and the development of our sense of morality, we can debate that. Like some theorists believe that, it's very distinct, very abrupt, like this happens and then you move to the next stage. And others believe that it's more of a fluid and continuous type of development, that you may, possess characteristics of one stage and the preceding stage, simultaneously as you advance through development. So stay tuned for that. And then the third and final issue is this question of stability or change. Concerning our personality, and this kind of connects to what we learned in Unit 10 on personality, but considering it, like, are we who we are when we are born, or does development kind of influence our personality? Like, does our personality change over time, or can outside forces, environmental influences, change who we are, like, at our core? So those are like the three big issues that are discussed in developmental psych. Okay, now on to the health class junk. Prenatal development. Conception, right? A woman's ovary releases a mature egg. The man's sperm reaches it, releases digestive enzymes that eat their way through the egg's protective covering. Do you remember all this from health class? All of that, when the sperm penetrates the egg, we would call conception. The egg and the sperm, as cells, right, their nuclei fuse, right, to become one. And at that point, we would refer to the living thing, the cluster of cells. We don't want to get into any moral debate here, but we just call it a zygote, right? And so during that first week, the cells within that cluster actually begin specializing in structure and function. So they'll start to differentiate, cells that are like, bone matter versus skin versus organ tissues. Like those cells will start to specialize at that point. From about 2 to 8 weeks of age, we will call the cells an embryo. That is, again, attached to the uterine wall of the female. And later, during the final stage of prenatal development, I don't think I typed it here, but we would call it a fetus. Okay, all of this cell dividing is occurring in what's known as the placenta. Okay, that is the protective outer covering or sac that is transferring the nutrients and the oxygen from the mother to the embryo, fetus, whatever stage you're in. It's what it's doing. The important thing to remember here is that along with the good, like nutrients and oxygen, the bad can also be transferred. And that's where this new vocabulary word comes into play, teratogens. A teratogen is any sort of harmful substance that can be passed to an embryo or a fetus via the placenta. And so like a big example would be moderate consumption of alcohol during pregnancy can affect the fetal brain. And so if you're, a heavy drinker, your baby would be at risk for birth defects and intellectual delays, which we would call fetal alcohol syndrome. So alcohol is a teratogen. if that is a good enough example for you. Okay, so yay, the fetus is born. Now we call it a baby. So the newborn comes pre-programmed with some stuff, quite handy actually. Infant reflexes. Let's see some of the big ones. Rooting and sucking, right? Moving itself towards a food source, such as a nipple, and then proceeding to suck. At the food source, swallowing, breathing, like all these things the baby comes ready to do in the form of reflexes. Concerning this, it's also kind of interesting that there are some other things that newborns come pre-programmed doing. And surprisingly enough, if they're not related to eating, they're related to social responsiveness, probably having to do with the fact that we as human beings don't really have the ability to survive without the, care, being under the care of other people. And so some of the examples of social responsiveness that a newborn will show you, they will turn their head in response to human voices. They will gaze at things that look at like faces, or will gaze at faces longer than they will gaze at inanimate objects. Their vision tends to be only in the 8 to 12 inch range, which ironically enough tends to be the approximate space between the face of a mother and a nursing child. And infants also come with the ability to recognize their mother's smell and voice. And so these things, if you think from that evolutionary psych perspective, probably served our ancestors fairly well in the survival of that particular offspring. And that offspring that couldn't do those things, ended up not surviving. All right, so how in the world do you study the development of this baby, this little sack of crying, whining, sleeping, pooping being? They can't really tell you what they're thinking. And so the way that you studied the newborn and development of the newborn is through what's called habituation, right? That's a simple form of learning that involves, if you remember from our Unit 6 on conditioning, a decrease in response to repeated stimulation, right? Sensory adaptation, we talked about it in Unit 4, and then we talked about it, habituation, in Unit 6, right? Like a mom constantly yelling at a kid doesn't quite get the same effect if it's something that's constant, as a form of stimulation. And so using habituation, right, that babies get bored with stuff that they see all the time, and novelty preference, meaning that they found that in infants, like what will they look at? Like, this is novel, or this is different or unique. That's how they know that we have all these social responsiveness things, like sights for, preferences for faces and all the things that I mentioned in the previous bullet. Okay, so let's advance to infancy and childhood. And we're only going to talk about the physical health-related things. We will talk about cognitive development in your next video. But let's first talk about maturation, right? Maturation is the biological growth process that enables orderly change in behavior and is relatively uninfluenced by experience, okay? So some great examples. Babies will learn to crawl, then walk. There's a specific order that we accomplish all of these things. How soon or late you do those things is primarily based on genetics. That, like, encouraging a kid to try to walk before they are biologically predisposed to do it isn't going to do any good. So don't feel bad if you're not trying to encourage a 2-month-old to walk. It's just they're not ready to do it physically. So that is maturation. Brain development. The developing brain in infancy and childhood is overproducing neurons like mad, right? And so we know, like, think back to our unit on language in that it's easier to teach a little kid language than it is to teach an older kid. This is an example why. Like, mad amounts of neurons, and that when those neurons go unused, pruning is what we will call it. We'll talk about that later. But pruning, like neurons that aren't being used, or connections between neurons that aren't being used, go away. What else is happening here? The frontal lobe is developing still between 3 and 6 years, which explains why Charlotte often lacks in rational planning, and that's where we get these wicked fun quotes I'm always sharing with you. It's that frontal lobe's underdeveloped. The last of the cortical areas to develop are those association areas that are linked with, thinking and memory. Those, advanced thinking comes with time, for biological reasons, not just environmental reasons. An example of this is that because our developing brains are so focused on, storing the implicit skills that we will need for the rest of our lives, like walking, talking, all of that good stuff, that cerebellum's mighty active. But that also explains why we all suffer from what's known as infantile amnesia, which is the inability to remember events prior to the age of 3. Now, there could be exceptions to that rule, but the vast majority of us don't, as a result of the association areas being underdeveloped and the cerebellum being so focused on the storing of those implicit memories. Okay, so bring any questions concerning the biological end of things with you to class tomorrow, and video 2 will deal with cognitive development. Thanks for listening.